let's move to our next section, which is true or false. I think we had an amazing conversation that it kind of extended a little bit more, but it was really, really productive to talk about everything, building and winning games. And actually that was amazing conversation. And I think a lot of people will benefit from this. So now moving on to true or false. The first one that I have for you is adrenal fatigue. Do you think this is a fad or fact? True, false?
Definitely fad. There's quite some research showing that adrenal fatigue doesn't occur. In fact, it would be almost beneficial if it did occur, because chronic stress, for example, is a result of chronically elevated cortisol levels and essentially non-adrenal fatigue. The adrenals, they keep pumping out the stress hormones, and therefore that suppresses the reproductive system, digestion, growth, repair, the immune system. And that's why you get symptoms of chronic stress and burnout. So it's actually almost unfortunate that it's a myth.
Is there anything that it kind of simulates that it could be truth, or why people say that there is an adrenal fatigue when there is not? What is the truth behind it?
I think there's very little truth behind it. I think people simply completely misunderstand the physiology behind it. The only truth is that they feel tired. And then, adrenal fatigue sounds like fatigue, but actually if the adrenals fatigue, that should mean that you don't get the stress response anymore, when usually it is the chronic stress that's leading to the sensation of fatigue, like feeling burned out.
Yeah, it's just weird. And I think it is just an excuse or a form of selling products like naturopath or osteopath. They always will kind of like take something that sounds medically interesting and medically sound, and it kind of drives sales, or like it sounds like you're smart and you kind of know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's exactly how bro science goes, actually. Like there's some feeling, and then that's rationalized or justified with some pseudoscience term, something that's usually speciously appealing. Even if it doesn't actually make sense, it's just like anabolic window, bro, or adrenal fatigue. So you have like this term that you can throw around, and then it's kind of legitimized. And then people, because they have the feeling, they feel like it's plausible and must be true. And those myths are incredibly hard to debunk when you have emotion plus some type of plausible theory. And even, funny enough, the myths that are the hardest to debunk are the ones that make no sense. Because if it made some sense and it was actually studied, like it's a real thing, actual scientists are talking about this and studying it, then it's easy to disprove because there's probably research on it. But if it's just total nonsense, then there won't be any research on it. And it actually sometimes is more difficult to disprove it.
Yeah. When we think about kind of a follow-up of that one, is anything related to adrenals is cortisol. Now, cortisol seems to be the enemy for anything that is related to weight gain. If you're gaining weight or you're too stressed, it's cortisol which is making you gain weight. Is it true or false that cortisol makes you gain weight? Indirectly, directly?
Acutely, cortisol is actually beneficial because it suppresses your appetite and slightly increases energy expenditure. However, chronically, the issue is that it often results in self-medication. So people become unhappier and stressed, and that leads them to use food as comfort food, as self-medication to make themselves feel better. And this is highly ineffective, but it seems that as humans, we keep doing it. And therefore, it tends to result in overeating, like emotional overeating, and makes diet adherence a whole lot harder. So theoretically, it should actually be beneficial, but in practice, we see that it's very detrimental in the long run.
Would you say that it's also related, like when people think about weight gain, especially acutely, could be more so water retention? Like when you're very stressed, there's like cortisol itself is a mineralocorticosteroid, so it's basically affecting your body fluids, and it's going to affect sodium regulation and everything else. So when you think about that, would you say that with these acute fluctuations in weight, people relate weight gain to cortisol. It's more so also that acute weight from water retention.
Yeah, that probably also plays a role, especially in like the span of days to a week or so. That people, they get bloated, and especially when you also don't feel good because of the stress, then it's easy to think like, oh my God, I'm getting fat, life sucks.
Yeah. Now, when we think about calories and nutrition labels nowadays being displayed in, I don't know, menus when we go out, do you feel like these nutrition profiles in fast food menus, restaurants, are actually helpful to make better food choices at all, or they don't actually make any difference?
For me personally, I love it when any restaurant has the macros on it. That is awesome. I think that's part of the reason why Chipotle is so popular among lifters, because at least you know what macros you're getting, and it's quite accurate too. So yeah, for lifters, it's absolutely awesome. There is a lot of research actually on whether it helps in terms of public health. I'm not fully up to date on that research, but the gist I got is that the effects are not nearly as good as hoped. There's some research, I think, indicating it does help, and other research showing it really doesn't. So yeah, I think to make those labels effective, people first need to be educated on what a calorie is, and that it's not just about carbs, but it's about the calories. And what is 100 calories? Is that a lot? Is that a little? You know, so the labels themselves probably don't do that much, absent more education about nutrition.
Do you think there is a lot of nutritional ignorance nowadays, even though there is a lot more communication and education around nutrition? But do you think there is still a very large need for even more basic nutrition education?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if the knowledge is worse than, say, 50 years ago. Probably isn't any better. Well, it probably isn't worse either. But the main problem now isn't the availability of the information, it's the enormous amount of noise that we have online. And problematically, that's a scenario where it would be great if the government advice was really solid and easy to understand and easily accessible, but it's not, and it's wrong in many occasions. So we're at a scenario where even though the information is already accessible, it's very hard to determine which information you should consume. And like, because it's not difficult, it's just like with smoking. If you tell somebody, just CICO, you know, calories in, calories out. If you consume fewer calories, then you're expending, then you're most likely going to lose fat. And that really is the whole story most people need to know in terms of the basics knowledge. But to find someone that they trust and that they heard this information and that they believe it and that they actually internalize it and make lifestyle change, that's the difficult part. It
is so hard to nowadays not listen to noise, because as you said, there is so much information. That's why I was thinking, are we lacking of information? But I don't think we're lacking of information, as you said. It's more, there is so much information out there, and it's so contradictory with the same advice. It kind of contradicts with each other. Some people say you shouldn't be eating vegetables. And other people say you should be eating vegetables 5 servings a day. Then you have other people saying you shouldn't be eating meat because meat is bad for you. But other people, you should be eating meat. So it's like, who the hell I have to listen to actually do the right thing? Because I guess people generally want to do the right thing, but in this paralysis analysis of like, there's so much contradictory, there's nothing concrete that it's just, this is the truth, just follow this and go. Like, yeah,
it's an interesting problem, and it's made a lot worse by social media, because there's now research showing that social media results in huge echo chamber effects, because social media give you what you want. So if social media know that you are a carnivore diet person, or you, even if they don't, for example, when I first went on YouTube and I created my account, I think I watched one video about something about Trump, and for some reason the algorithm thought, Trump supporter. So it kept bombarding me, and it was quite hard to get it around. Like, I had to tell, like, not interested, don't recommend channel, not interested, not interested, not interested, to really re-educate the algorithm, and it wouldn't let go of it. It's like, no, you are a Trump supporter. Believe me, you don't know it, but you are. So if you have that with carnivore diet or veganism or something, the algorithm feeds you all the information that you want to see. And if you're not super open-minded and you don't pay a lot of attention to the fact that the algorithm is distorting your perception, then yeah, you get a massively distorted view of reality. And I think that's a huge problem in our society right now, that people on social media in general, which is most everyone, has a completely distorted view of reality because they are only listening to the echo chamber effects being fed to them by their social media.
It is so true. And I have had the similar experiences with the YouTube or even TikTok. Like TikTok is massive without the algorithm. I want to move to the next question. And I think it is interesting to hear your thoughts, true or false, around we all have the same 24 hours. What is your stance on this? True or false?
I mean, in what sense? I mean, it's true objectively that we have the same 24 hours, but of course we differ in our responsibilities, amount of work that we have, and even physiological things like how much sleep we need.
Yep. And I guess this question comes a lot because it is very common to say, especially some personal trainers that want to sort of put you in this guilt mindset, you have to act, because everyone has the same 24 hours, but probably we don't. As you mentioned, there is so much intricacies and specific things happening into each person's life that is probably very difficult to say the same statement is for everyone the same.
Yeah, it's much easier said than done. I do agree with the sentiment that most people dramatically undervalue their health and fitness and most things that they think they want to get better at. Because objectively, if you look at the time investment, if you're spending 4 hours a day on TikTok and you say that you want to look as good as all those people on TikTok, but you're not going to the gym more than 30 minutes on average per week, then of course your priorities are distorted, right? Because you could, even if you spend, well, what is it, like 5% of your TikTok time on going to the gym, you would have better results and you'd probably feel a lot better as a result.
Yeah, I guess it also comes to priorities, but I suppose if we took the priorities out, like you really are doing the best you can, but you just don't have the time, or you just can't afford to sacrifice certain things over others, or you just at the end of the day you end up neglecting yourself because it's the only thing that you kind of don't have time for. So I guess it comes back down to priorities, but I don't know, it's a really tough question. It's really, really hard because it just comes, so it's a sensible question depending on who you're referring to, what sort of situation and the context we are trying to sort of explain. But yeah, it is a tough one. All right, well, let's move to the biggest questions, and I guess this is just something that we're going to try to go relatively quick, but I want to get your opinions, bit of explanation, because I know you will have a really good answer for this. So how can I determine, and probably more accurately, RIR, so reps in reserve, in practice, especially at the beginning of your mesocycle? It is really hard to say, well, I'm just going to do 3 RIR in my first week of my mesocycle, and I have no idea what a 3 RIR would look like in each exercise I'm going to do. So how do you actually know that you're doing 3 RIR and you're not shooting too low or too high?
Yeah, many people go wrong with higher RIR estimates. They're not very accurate. Most people are only accurate within 1 repetition, which is probably what we are trying to do when we set these numbers. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to even have the numbers. When we go within 3 reps in reserve, 3 reps in reserve is pretty much the max that most people can somewhat accurately judge. Interestingly, we don't get better at it with time either. There's now a lot of research on this. People don't get better at estimating how close they are to failure, but you can get better at knowing how close you are to failure by simply repping out, trying to go to failure, and having an idea of, oh, if 100 times 10 is was my failure point, last week, then 7 now must be 3 reps away from failure, 3 reps in reserve. So then you basically just know it. And probably, even though the research doesn't find it, I think if you really do it that way, actively focused on improving your skill set with and testing yourself, not just doing the test, because you need feedback. That's the point. You need objective, acute feedback. And if you do that and you actively think about it, and also when you know, okay, so this is 3 reps in reserve, and then you do the set and you really reflect on how do I feel right now, I would think that method should allow you to actually improve in accuracy somewhat. But it's all contingent on the fact of really being able to push yourself to failure to begin with. And that also varies between individuals. So because of all these problems, I usually recommend to people that they stay pretty close to failure. And if I feel that someone is not like super motivated, I often tell them to just train to failure, because they probably won't truly hit failure anyway. Many people won't. In fact, a recent meta-analysis found that the average gym goer leaves 7 reps in reserve on average during their training. 7, that's warm-up set level pretty much. So yeah, for a lot of people, the whole discussion is kind of moot, and the much more important part is just to make sure they really push themselves.
Would it be wise then to start your mesocycle going all the way to failure to know what that looks like, and then kind of go backwards?
Yeah, it could. And I often actually start mesocycles with RM testing, usually not 1 RMs, but usually like 3 to 5 RMs. And based on that, you also have an idea of what benchmarks to go for, and you can calculate percentages of 1 RM that you want to use. And then I also have them rep out with a lighter weight. There's some research also that shows that you can get an idea of their, not just muscle fiber type, but their overall like strength versus endurance genetics. So if they do really well with the lower weight, for example, and relative to their supposed 1 RM, then they're probably better at strength endurance versus strength.
Okay.
And there's also some research that people are genetically, that they respond better long-term to the type of training that they are genetically better at.
Okay.
Which kind of makes sense, right? If you're like a born sprinter and you can try to force yourself to run marathons, but you're probably never gonna have the same results as if you're a born sprinter and you're gonna do sprinting. Then people usually progress a lot faster. So I think there is actually quite some argument to be made for that. Because if you start low, then yeah, it might be a long time before you really go to failure or close to failure even.
Would you prefer using RPE versus RIR, or doesn't matter?
Definitely RIR. I actually use reps to failure, which is the same as reps in reserve essentially, except the scale is 1 point different. So 0 reps to failure means actually failing. 1 rep to failure means that the next rep would fail. The difference is that 1 rep in reserve or 0 reps in reserve, it's hard to say if that means 1 rep to failure, as in as many reps as possible, or are you actually failing the rep? And there's a substantial difference in that in terms of stimulus to fatigue. But that's, I mean, you can use both RIR or RTF, but RPE is much more subjective. And many people invert RPE, which is, even in that scenario, is just needlessly complicated. You think it's an 8 RPE because it's 2 reps in reserve. Like why not just do 2 reps in reserve, right? And RPE also has a connotation of effort. In fact, the original scale was called the Borg scale, which was 6 to 20, I think. I had no idea why they chose 6 to 20 as the scale, but yeah, that was the scale. And it was related to effort rather than trying to estimate the repetitions. And a lot of research found that when you frame it as effort, it becomes horrendously inaccurate. It becomes super susceptible to use of caffeine, music, genetic differences, where you have like the hardcore bodybuilder that was in NAM, and he's like going to beyond failure with assistance from a spotter, and he's like, I got 3 more. And then you have the individual that's like, oh, I felt something. Nope, that's it for me. So it becomes super inaccurate when you start framing it as perceived effort. You really have to try to objectively evaluate how many repetitions you think you could still do.
Okay. And I guess my next question would be, does the RIR may be different as your technique improves? Because I guess when you don't have a proper technique and you're just doing whatever comes out of your technique for that particular exercise, let's say a deadlift, for example. Like if you don't have a proper technique, you may either be closer to failure, or you may not even get to failure any time because you don't really know how to properly lift. And the other thing that I was going to ask next to that is, do you think that the RIR may be a bit more or how to frame it, will depend more on those who perhaps have someone to rely on as a spotter, as if you're training by yourself? Like, I am probably more conservative if I'm training by myself on a big lift. Like, I don't want to have a really heavy barbell on me and not being able to stand up. So I kind of rather become more conservative, and I'll be probably much more far away from true failure, as if I had someone pushing me and on my back, that I know that if I fail, at least I get someone to push me. Is that something that you find that is common just to see in among lifters?
Definitely, and there's even research on that showing that people with a spotter, they push closer to failure, interestingly, while decreasing the RPE often. So that's another example of where we see that perceived exertion is completely subjective, and it doesn't really relate well to objective performance. It can even go the other way, because the comfort of a spotter also massively decreases the anxiety, so you feel more comfortable pushing yourself. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it does both. It makes it feel easier while you are actually pushing harder. And in terms of the RPE or the reps in reserve estimate becoming better with technique, that I think that is true. Not because, as I said, you actually become better at estimating it. Research typically finds that we don't, but it decreases the performance variability. In fact, I think for coaches, one of the best things, and for people themselves too, one of the best things you can look at to see if your technique is good, if your performance is variable. Because a lot of people will say, like, yeah, you have good days, you have bad days. You know, some days I don't get like 5 reps more than others. If somebody says that, you know that their technique sucks, because there is no way that a good lifter is going to have a 5 rep difference in what, say you were 10 RMs, you're 5 RM one day, then either you were simply, there's a massive difference in effort, or your technique is completely different. Because there's research on powerlifters, for example, and Olympic weightlifters, and even with all of the practices of the peak week, the taper, the anxiety of being on stage, using different equipment than normal, being in your competitive outfit, all of these things, the performance variance, like from one set to the next, or from one PR to the other, is usually like 2.5% max, and usually less. So when your technique is really good, the variance in your performance should be super low. Like if you can hit 8 reps, that's your true 8 RM, then it should still be 8 reps tomorrow. Like maybe if you're a novice, you already respond and you can do an extra rep or something, but it's not going to be 5. So the variance in your performance is actually a super good measure, I find, of how good someone's technique is. And by virtue of that, if your technique improves, your performance is going to be much more stable. And if your performance is more stable, you can, of course, also more accurately estimate how close you are to failure, even if only because you know that your performance, it should be this as opposed to where it is now.
Are we talking about muscular failure or technical failure?
This would be momentary muscle failure.
Yeah. Muscle failure.
I think, yeah. If your technique is good, technical failure and momentary muscle failure should usually be the same.
Okay.
It depends on the exercise, but for most exercises, and that's also a good tip for people. If someone says, you should do it this way, and if it makes you weaker, then there should be good reason for that. Now, if that reason is, for example, range of motion, that's a very good reason. If you can go into longer muscle lengths with a squat because you squat deeper, research finds, yes, you develop more strength, more size by squatting deeper. Good reason. But if somebody says for the squat, you have to push your knees out more, even though your knee tracking is okay, but they're just like, this is how they learned it, you have to do it this way. And then you feel like, oh, I'm a lot weaker this way. And it doesn't improve my range of motion, it doesn't feel better on any joints or anything, then probably that's not really better technique for you. So very often technique cues, barring changes in range of motion or removing cheating body parts, like with a curl, not using the whole body to curl up the weight instead of just the biceps, they should make you stronger. Like if somebody gives you tips for the bench press, especially for powerlifting purposes, like retracting shoulder blades, being more stable, that should make you stronger. Maybe not this session already, but when you're used to the technique, it should. So technical failure, if your technique's really good, shouldn't be far off from muscle failure for most exercises.
I have a question about technique improvement and somehow the capacity of you being able to do such a really good quality training with the technique you have, that you actually have to reduce the volume because you no longer have the capacity to train as hard with more volume if your technique is just getting out, squeezing out of each set. I find myself, like, since I've worked way better into my technique, I find myself doing 2 sets and maximum 3 in certain exercises, and I'm done. Like, I can't do any more. Even if my program asks me to do 4 sets, I can't do 4. Like, it would be just junk volume for me. What do you think about that?
There's definitely truth to that. If you increase your range of motion in particular, you also maybe get more muscle damage. You're pushing closer to failure. You can definitely increase the stimulus that you get per set. Now, there are definitely limits to this, because if we look at the literature on aggregate, there were 2 recent meta-analyses, basically, or systematic reviews, finding essentially the same thing, that training volume is much more important than how close you train to failure. So, basically HIIT has really not lived up to the science. If you do like 1 set to absolute muscle failure, that is in no way going to get the same effects as 4 sets, assuming you can recover from it. So there is definitely a limit to how much you can squeeze out of 1 set, but for sure you can make a set more effective with better technique.
In that case, should you reduce the effort of that set to make it to the 4th set? For example, if you're just falling short, you're like, I'm definitely completely out with the 3rd set, but I should be doing 4. Should you do the 4th and kind of sacrifice a bit more in the first 3, or should you just do the best you can on the 3 and just take the 4th out?
You can get equivalent results with both if your total work output, as in total amount of repetitions that you do, ends up approximately the same. For strength, it tends to be better to stay a bit further away from failure and do more sets. For size, both approaches can be equally viable. So it depends on your total work volume. Also, it's especially for size, there's no harm in taking some weight off, especially if your reps otherwise drop to 4 or fewer. Then it probably is better to just take some weight off, even if you're not going to absolute balls out failure. Just doing another set of 6 reps at your, say, 8 RM at that time can be still very effective to get additional volume in without burning yourself out. Generally, I would say if you're going to failure, I would do it on the later sets as opposed to the first set.
Yeah, I guess for those beginners, it's going to be really hard to sort of stop and say, well, I am putting my best effort. Like, how can I just stop if I know I have some more extra reps? So that I just forget about them and I just wait until my next set to do another sort of set, or I just want to do the best I can. It's kind of like, it's just challenging to sort of decide. And so what would you do in that case?
I mean, you need to learn it. And I think for beginners, often there is certainly a period where just pushing to failure is beneficial because you don't need a lot of volume. And recovery is probably also not going to be a big issue, which is kind of a weird situation that advanced lifters never have, because recovery normally lifts how much you can do. But beginners, they don't need that much volume, and recovery also as a result of that is probably not going to be a big issue. So for them, just learning to push to failure while retaining good technique might be more important than the fine-tuning of these variables.
That's awesome. I appreciate so much your time. I cannot thank you enough for your patience with me and with the IGLI failing and then all of this. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything that you are working on, any for future projects, anything coming for you?
Joining Spotify and Apple Podcasts probably, but Spotify primarily because you can do video podcasts. So yeah, that's the next thing I'm working on. And other than that, just producing more content and still involved with scientific studies and stuff.
That's awesome.
I also have a question for you, by the way. In
Okay.
Australia, do you also, can I call you mate, even if you're a woman?
Yeah.
All right, so I can say my pleasure, mate.
Yeah. It is very common. It is very common to talk about, hey, mate. Yeah.
All right, perfect, mate.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much again for your time. I know you also have some training courses or certifications.
Yep, I have a PT certification program for those really interested in the nitty-gritty or wanted to become a personal trainer or your own PT. It's, I think, the best in the market, of course. But it's really for the people that are really interested in the advanced knowledge.
That's awesome. I think it is worth, guys, to checking that out. And I'll talk to you soon.
Great.
Bye, mate.
Right. See you. See you, mate.